Thank you very much for this persistence for this last presentation. We are going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about, I've got my colleague in the audience back there who will answer the difficult questions, but we'll be talking about an Aboriginal community in the middle of Alberta oil sands who is inundated with impacts from oil sands, and we're trying to cope with those impacts. And one of the longest standing impacts are odors. And I'm saying oil sands of Alberta, you'll hear different descriptors of that industrial operation: tar sands, bitumen sands. Technically, the correct term is bitumen sands, and people on the right and the left will call it oil, bitumen, tar sands, depending on their political event. But it's a fairly large industrial operation, and I want to talk about the perceptions and of a First Nation community and what we're doing to try and address odor issues. Alberta is 3 hours flying straight west. For those of you who don't know Canada very well, the oil sands are in the northeast of Alberta. They are amongst the largest reservoirs of oil in the world, and some of the oil, well, all the oil is a thick bitumen, kind of a hydrocarbon embedded in sand, and sometimes it's near the surface and you can surface mine it, and we have some pretty significant mines being used right now, with more on the way. And when it's deeper, we don't surface mine it because it's too laborious to get the dirt off the top, so you drill down and do SAGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage developments. Fort McKay is a group of 700 individuals, not that many. They were moved off the landscape in the sort of 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and pushed into schools and a community in Fort McKay by the federal government as part of their sort of management of the Indian problem in Canada, or whatever you call that. And this community exists today. It's on the banks of the Athabasca. This is a photograph, aerial shot of Google Earth, showing Fort McKay just on the west bank of the Athabasca. Up is north, and there are some developments you can see as you come into Fort McKay. You come in over airplanes, you can certainly see the developments that are happening very near the community. Oil sands developments, industrial development, depends on your perspective. Sensitive microphone, sorry. It depends on your perspective whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing. We need to develop economically, and it's always a question, I think, for governments to decide whether or not they'll develop quickly, how much money to put into environmental protection, how to manage the environment, and that's certainly a balance. We're seeing that balance in Alberta swing far one way. I think we just had a landslide of political change in our province from a very conservative, right-wing kind of a political party, or right-wing for Canada, to a modestly left-wing or political party, which was a big deal in Canadian politics, and I think it will have ramifications in the federal election. But where you're sitting on an issue drives your view of that issue. This is an image you can see it both up and down, and some people might have seen an old woman's face appear, and some people would have only seen the young woman's face, depending on what you're used to seeing and what your perceptions are. And some people can see both. The Aboriginal perspective is certainly unique, and that's an important perspective for us. This is sort of a nice lake in the boreal forest. Aboriginal appreciation of the landscape is more about natural environment than anything else. That's a loon call, which we got some tapes put onto it so you give you some experience of the boreal forest. Some enthusiastic loons. And that's the noise that an Aboriginal in McKay, and Aboriginals right throughout Alberta and other places, would really value. When you have industrial development, you don't get that noise, and they would be compromised. That wasn't part of my presentation, but you do often find that in the community too. For many years, generations, eons, the native communities lived off the land, and many still do. They'll go and hunt, they'll go and trap, they'll take berries. A a lot of the elders would grow up taking 100% of their food from the land. Long history of land use. You'll find modern-day trappers' cabins sort of abandoned around the landscape on trap lines, and instead of just sort of refurbishing cabins, you often find whoever owns that trap line, owns now, if you use that term, will just abandon it and move on and build another one. So Fort McKay is sitting on the banks of the Athabasca. It was a pristine environment up until maybe 50 or 60 years ago, and now it's being progressively inundated with industry, and you have a population of Aboriginal people whose ancestors grew up on that land, they've grown up on that land, and they don't really have anywhere else to go, because if they go into Calgary or Edmonton or any other city, they're just a foreigner, they've lost everything. They really are connected to this landscape, and it's a real dilemma, I think, for governments is to manage the expectations of these kinds of groups on the landscape when industrial development is imminent. There's only 700 or so people in this community, but they're right smack in the middle of the oil sands development. And I think when federal government sort of pushed them onto this reservation area, they didn't realize there was oil sands underneath, and now there's a conflict, now there's a problem. Usually the federal government will get its way, we'll see. So industrial development has created many impacts on the environment of Fort McKay. Looking for another slide. If I have a window that's showing up here, is that blocking the slides from moving? You can get rid of that window. But right now, oil sands development has strip mined something like 700 square kilometers in northeast Alberta. That is about the size, just a little bit bigger than the greater metropolitan area of Toronto, which is, I think, is 600 odd square kilometers. And there's another 70 odd square kilometers of tailings ponds. And tailings ponds are a real problem. They're a permanent feature on the landscape. Got a colloidal suspension of pollutants with many sort of toxins, and you'll hear that being the biggest environmental impact on the news is what we're going to do with these tailings ponds. They are a source of a lot of our odors. This is the beginning where we've got leases have been approved for an additional 4,000 square kilometers of land in northeast of Alberta. And I think the provincial government is going to be very taxed to try and figure out how they manage that. Some of the older industries have practices that were grandfathered in, and a lot of the newer industries, there's tighter and tighter controls. So it's a balance between stewardship and economic development. It's a tailings pond picture from the air. Another tailings pond picture. There is no solution at the moment to tailings ponds. Some of the newer companies are attempting dry tailings operations where they won't leave any tailings ponds. But right now these ponds, they're big lakes, but they're more or less a permanent feature on the landscape. Air pollution and odors are emitted from tailings ponds, and air pollution and odors are emitted from the upgrading and operations in oil sands developments. Largely, this is an uninhabited, area of Alberta. The federal government, one of the ministers was caught out by saying no humans have ever or could really survive up there, which the Aboriginals in McKay took a great exception to, and the people that are north of them. But that's Fort McKay, just up on the banks of the Athabasca. That's Scentroid. This here, the air is predominant wind is heading off to the east. Predominant wind is generally from the south to the north. That is one of Scentroid's tailings ponds. You can sort of see the size of the tailings ponds and the proximity to a community. And an example of some of the evaporative vapor forming off a tailings pond in the winter. We also get odors coming off mining equipment as emissions. When we bare the face of oil sands, you get a lot of hydrocarbons, fresh hydrocarbon exposed. So you get a lot of hydrocarbons in the air. You'll also get a lot of particulates being picked up when it's windy, and that has association with odors as well. And then the processing facilities. We do have a lot of high-tech monitoring going on. This is a recent air monitoring station that the Environment Canada put in. And I think it's going to be a permanent feature on the landscape in McKay. But there is millions of dollars worth of high-tech monitoring, GCs, ability to sample, lots of real-time monitoring, LiDAR systems coming out of that new facility. We also have some regional air monitoring stations. In addition to that, federal station. And Fort McKay also constructs their own sampling systems. We take canisters, we take odor reports from the community, we have samples that we send away for analysis. We have got odor tech systems in the community, I think 2 so far, and we're considering a 3rd. This is a less sampling system which we're devising to pull air during odor events through charcoal tubes or 10x tubes, seal them off and have them analyzed later on in an attempt to get some assessment of the chemistry behind the odor event. There are discrete episodes. This is all from July 18th. I'm sure this is 2014. This is discrete odor events that sort of trip through the community, and there's a paper that we've got that's reproduced all these figures and graphs in the paper, so I'm not going to go through them in this late time in the afternoon at any length of time, but generally we have air coming from the south. Sometimes and often there is no odors, but very often, almost daily now, there are episodes and events, and we know something about the composition of the odors, reduced sulfurs and hydrocarbons and oxides of nitrogen and sulfur. Odors monitoring morning and afternoon. When these odor events happen, the few individuals that try and manage the system and the environment in Fort McKay are contacted. Often it's David there that get a phone call at any time saying, hey, there's an odor in the community, what's going on, why are we smelling this? And often it's just, hey, it's the wind direction coming off a tailings pond, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's a plant upset coming on. I think we've had 3 serious plant upsets where people are hospitalized. A lot of people are really ill, vomiting. A lot of people extremely worried, don't know if they should evacuate the community, don't know what to do. And we don't get a lot of guidance from our government. And we don't get a lot of guidance from the industry, because often they're saying, hey, it's not us. So there's 4 or 5 industry in the area, and they're sort of pointing their fingers at each other, but nobody's taking responsibility, and there's no effective management. So you just have a very scared population not knowing when to evacuate. It might just be a routine odor event, it's just another odor insult, or there might be something more sinister and more deadly behind it. Sometimes we have a heads up, often we don't. Midday odors, more midday odors. This is just some snapshots. These are the things we know about our odors. We know that the air quality is regularly affected by a wide variety of pollutants. Most odor events associated with southerly winds. We have most of our industry to the south, a little bit to the northeast, but soon the community will be surrounded by industry, and when that happens, there's going to be a process played out, and it might be played out in regional groups under rational discussion. I fear it'll probably be played out in the courts. Total reduced sulfurs, hydrocarbons, and SO2 are strongly correlated with odor events. We're finding eNose technology interesting. We thought we would be able to abuse that technology by using it for an ambient monitoring because our odors are significant. We thought we might be able to triangulate, put 3 sensors around the community. We thought we'd be able to use that to identify the incoming nature of an odor and perhaps identify source identification. It's not working out so well unless the odor events are high. We do know that we need a multidisciplinary science approach. We do know we need to use local human noses if we were going to address the odor episodes in chemistry and sourcing of odors, and we hope we get government support and regional support from industry in a collaborative way as to try and figure out where the odors are coming from. That's Fort McKay. The community, these are, my pointer's dying. These little pink spots are its traditional lands. This is a Suncor facility, the old Petro-Canada facility that was first introduced in the late 50s, I think, as a strip mining operation. Mostly this is strip mining of oil sands. Further away, the oil is no longer near the surface, so you get into SAGD and sort of more linear disturbance of the landscape as people drill and take the oil out through, basically put down steam and suck it out through a tube. We have all the green facilities are existing structures, existing oil sands facilities now, Syncrude and Suncor, CNRL and Shell. And they're growing and expanding, and the government's leasing more land, often very quickly, and they've been criticized for it, and that's largely, I think, one of the reasons why, well, maybe one of the reasons the last government was kicked out of office, without necessarily having a plan of how the environment management will go down. And Fort McKay is arguing, hey, have a plan and involve us. Let us sit at the table, let us discuss the plan along with industry and NGOs and both levels of government. The future for the community of McKay is going to be grim as other developments take hold, and it won't really matter which way the wind is blowing from. If industry is relatively unregulated and there isn't any Odour recognition or management, and there currently isn't, then it's going to be a bit of a nightmare. And we've heard already that Odour is an important part of environmental stewardship. It's not clear where that's going to go. I'm going to skip through this quickly. If we're talking about good management systems, what is a good management system? And that is one that can take industrial development and satisfy the needs of a boreal forest or a fen or a bog system, or satisfy the needs of a pristine community or a remote community. Environmental management has to balance that up, economic development and stewardship responsibly. So the good aspects of our regulatory systems in Alberta is that we have identified many of the aspects of pollution. We've got things in place. There are documents that talk about pollution management, mitigation, best practices. We have documents that talk about odors. The downside is that the government often controls the implementation of the regulation, and their directives aren't specific. They're open to interpretation. So it's not always clear what should happen. And I think there's a lot of lip service being paid to words and documents and not so much action on the ground. And Fort McKay is concerned because government is playing a little bit too many roles. It's the resource owner, it's the resource developer, and it's the manager of the resources. We talk about arm's length operation, arm's length sort of establishment of bodies that might manage the environment. And arm's length, when you talk to government, is a little bit too corruptible, it's a little bit too close, there's too many conflicts of interest. Our government is an environmental regulator, and also government is a protector of treaty rights. You know, in Western Canada, our lawyer tells us that, what's the number now? 220 cases were brought to provincial governments or federal governments in Western Canada over the last decade, something like that, 220 cases. And the federal government lost 2/3 of them. So the Aboriginal party that brings the case to court invariably wins because they've got an issue to resolve. And we were told that maybe governments kind of establish their policies through the courts by sort of pushing a population to see what they can get away with. They get sued and they say, oh, okay, well, that's not a problem. But those are Canadian tax dollars going to waste. And right after the governments lose a case, industry then sues the government because invariably they're stopped. And so they lose money. So then industry will sue the government and get whatever their losses, current and future, back. So we, as Canadians, we pay again, and then we pay again. It's so inefficient. But it's the way government works right now. This is a statement from the Supreme Court of Canada, and it was, you know, often when you have a real issue in Canada, it goes before the courts. People don't like the decision. It's bounced around for a while, and eventually we'll end up at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is our last stop, and invariably they'll look at constitutional rights and the letter of the law, and treaty rights are a powerful thing, and that's what our Aboriginals have. I like this term here, government objectives, superficially neutral. And I don't know if you're into Japanese poetry, but haiku, there's a great haiku poem there. So the same limitations that apply to general environmental management will also apply to odors. Yeah, we've got statements within regulatory documents that talk about odors and talk about, hey, we shouldn't release odors, but there's nothing really specific there to say, hey, don't do it, or let's find out where they're coming from, or let's force certain mitigations or better practices in the industry to stop them happening. There's no real detail around how much odor is acceptable. It's not just McKay, it's everywhere, but McKay is taking the brunt of it. We've got a community that was Aboriginal, pristine environment, going into a heavily polluted environment with some fairly nasty odor episodes. I have a friend of mine who's a wildlife biologist, and I asked him, I got 5 minutes? Thank you. No. Oh, I'm ending. Okay. Then I'm going to flick to where I wanted to, thank you very much. I know it's the end of the day. We don't really know what the effects are of odors on the environment, and we don't know what the effect of odors are on animals. I wanted to make one association before I finish. If we have odors in the community, and you have an Aboriginal community, odors normally will not hurt our health. We talk about some sort of minor health issues. If they change your behavior in a significant way, they can damage your health. And if you had odors in an Aboriginal community, and the Aboriginal community were used to gathering food off the land, and their alternative is pretty crappy store-bought food, which they can ill afford, and it really is expensive when you get up north, and it really is low quality. You don't no longer collect food on the land. So now you're into store-bought food. So now you're into sort of the problems that Western poor quality food have in terms of obesity and diabetes. But you're also eroding cultural sort of systems and cultural support and the stability of a community. So then you end up with more addictions and suicides and some other mental health issues. And you end up with lots of indirect health impacts. And that's something that nobody is measuring. And I think they're prevalent they're prevalent to some extent wherever we have odors, but for Aboriginal people, it's more acute. And I'll just leave you with that message. The odors can be a health effect, and far greater health effect than we imagine in our normal day-to-day assessment of odors. Thank you.
But since you said that there is legislation for odor, and maybe there is a limit, but obviously there is odor legislation in Alberta, wouldn't the government have to do something, at least do the assessment that you wouldn't have to do yourself?
If an odor is reported and it's reported enough times, then there will be an investigation, but I'm not sure too much is done about it. It certainly wouldn't be enough to satisfy the needs of community. Often the government has an odor hotline, and one of the difficult things about that is they record, hey, we've had all these odor complaints all these years, but look, the odor complaints are declining because we're having less phone calls. The people are just tired of phoning in. So the words are there, there's something to go on, but there's not enough to say, hey, industry, don't create those odors, and that we're not there yet.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so you have orders currently with the current operation. So 2 questions is, what can be done from the current operations that can resolve or limit the emissions? And what can be done in the future before developing the new operations as a management to avoid emissions?
Yeah.
It's something that there's the 2 aspects there.
Yeah. So the second question, I'm sure the new operators that are coming in have to work to a much higher standard than the grandfathered older industries. I think one of the things that government can do is take a hard look at the people that have licenses already, that have been running for 20 or 30 years, and say, hey, your grandfather clause is about to close down. You have to upgrade into better mitigations and better controls in your systems. That's not possible with the tailings ponds. These are massive features on the landscape which do emit odors. So I think that's going to just take decades. Your first question, I'm not sure I heard it.
You know there are some sources now. You have identified some sources of emission emissions.
Sources of emissions, yeah.
Okay, so is there something that is physically done? You can do beyond that, economically viable for the companies to be done at this large scale?
Yeah.
When you have the excavation, for instance, for the oil sands and so on, you said there will be some hydrocarbons and so on. Is there a solution, technical solutions? Or?
Yeah, I think there's technical solutions, but I think the first thing that has to happen is people have to sort of accept that odors are occurring, which I think by and large it's there, although there's some deniers, and then accept that they should be managed. Accept that they should be managed, and that realization is not in northeast of Alberta. It's not in the oil sands mentality yet. There's some movement, but it's just starting, the management of it. And so once we accept they should be recognized and managed, then we can go to pushing controls. And I think a lot of my friends in industry would love to mitigate odors because that's one of their main sources of conflict with local communities, Aboriginal communities. I mean, there's hundreds of millions of dollars at play, and it's a major source of conflict, but the industry needs the mandate from government to spend the money because otherwise they're just ripping off their shareholders without a good reason. So it's government leadership we're missing, in my opinion.
Okay.
I remember working on some EIA's late 90s and
Environmental impact assessments?
Environmental impact assessments for Scentroid, Millennium, Scentroid, Millennium,
Yep.
Firebag, and all those
Yep.
first big projects. And even at that time, Odour were addressed within the EIAs.
Orders were mentioned in the EIAs.
They were mentioned.
Okay.
They were mentioned. There are no, there's not a taxonomy or anything, but it was at least odor threshold. And actually, and like you said, they were mentioned. Is it possible if at like 15, 16, 17 years ago it was mentioned, you can go back to their permits and look at what
You know, that kind of ancient history, it's almost black and white, but luckily my friend David Spink probably reviewed some of those in his time. He's either working for the government. David, do you think it's possible to go back in time and hold Suncor and Syncrude accountable for odor issues way back in that day?
Possibly, but it's a good question, and in fact, for McKay, because in EIA's new projects, odor impact assessments are to be conducted. And they're token assessments. They use odor threshold numbers from the 1970s, and of course, if you use those odor threshold numbers, you're never going to show an odor impact. And so we have asked them to use some specific, we outline specific odor thresholds that we want them to use for compounds that we think are causing or potentially causing some of the odors in the region. We've asked them to do certain modeling, certain averaging periods, because the old ones were 1 hour averaging periods. So again, downplaying the impact of odors. And to how do you treat mixtures? And they were treating them individually. So if nothing hit a threshold, everything was fine. So we've asked them to treat odors as additive. And we've also asked them, and I'll look at my friend Richard here from Alberta Environment and Parks, to provide some specific guidance on how these assessments should be done. But the biggest problem is we have no olfactometry information on sources or regional levels, so we don't have any benchmarks to use to do these assessments and produce meaningful results. So we're hoping the future will be better.
You know, I'll just talk about that disconnect. I think this might be one more question. I'm sorry for going on this afternoon, but in Alberta, we have an air quality health index where you take some levels of particulates and sulfur dioxides and nitrogen dioxides and ozone and some other things and say, hey, the air quality is good today, bad today, improving today, or whatever. And a little while ago, we had an episode, well, we had a number of episodes, where the AQHI, our index, was 1. It was air quality was primo, number 1 air quality, yet the communities that near the oil sands were inundated with reduced sulfurs and hydrocarbons, and they weren't measured as part of the AQHI. So here you have these Aboriginal people in an environment that stinks. Like, we would all go, I can't eat my lunch, this stinks, it really stinks. And a government source saying, our air quality is great, it's number 1, it couldn't be better, it's number 1. And there's just such a disconnect. You think, wow, how? And that one of the requests from Fort McKay is, if you're going to develop this kind of stuff, have everybody sitting at the table so we can pick this kind of disconnect up before it goes public and before it advances. Because then once this air index is out, it's very difficult to sort of reverse it, put it back in the box, and prove it, because people have put such an effort into making it for good reasons, but just missed this important part of it. And not often enough, we don't have all the voices at the table, and then you end up with disconnected legislation.
Thank you very much. I think tomorrow David will be presenting another paper.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.